Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I'd like to start with doing short funeral chant for Esko. Anicca vata sankara upadava yadamino upajitava nirujanti te sangvupasamo sukho. Anicca vata sankara upadava yadamino upajitava nirujanti te sangvupasamo sukho. Anicca vata sankara adava yadamino upajitava nirujanti te sangvupasamo sukho. Achirang vatayankayo patavang adise sati chudo apeta vinyano niritang va kalingarang. So yesterday at noon, Esko was cremated, our friend Esko, and his family is going to follow his wishes and scatter his ashes at one of his favorite places in the mountains in British Columbia. Most of you here knew Esko. He was here for 13 years. And he built that cabin on the property. He's been quite ill for the last couple of years, and increasingly this last year. His death, I think, was perceived by himself and his close people as a release. He was not happy in his reduced circumstances. He was always a active and independent sort of a cuss, and he didn't much like being in the nursing home and waited upon and restricted in his movements. As always, when someone dies, it's extremely important for us to reflect on the inevitability of our own passing. The general theme in my experience in Thailand, funeral situations, when the senior monk is invited to give a talk, it's always on the theme of, you see him lying there, well, you're next. Won't be long till you're up there. And me too. So this is one thing that the Buddha told us that we should reflect on often. Maranasati is reflect on our own mortality. That this life, this body is impermanent. And we do not know the time or place or means of our death. We just know that it's certain it will come. We might live to a very old age, or we might die from accident or misadventure or disease at a young age. There's no way of knowing. We can't count on any time. The Buddha once was speaking to some of the monks, and he asked them, how do you contemplate impermanence? And one monk said, when I get up in the morning, I always reflect, this could be my last day, I better make it count. And the Buddha said, oh, you're way off the mark. He asked the next one, what do you think? How do you contemplate impermanence? And he said, when I sit down to do an hour's meditation, I think I better make this count because it could be the last one in this lifetime. And the Buddha said, well, that's a bit better, but you still haven't really got it. And the third monk said, when I take an in-breath, I think I may not live to breathe out again. When I breathe out, I think I may not live to breathe in again. And the Buddha said, that's the way you should look at it. People tend to avoid facing the reality of death. They imagine that it's depressing or morbid to think of death, but it's actually the contrary. When you come to fully appreciate the reality of impermanence, then the fear of death goes away because you have accepted it. This is a reality. This is a experience we're all going to eventually come to. The big question is destiny, is what occurs after death. In individual cases, we cannot know. I sincerely hope that our good friend Esko is speedily taking a good rebirth. And I have reasonable grounds to think that that will be the case. There's no certainty, but he made a great deal of merit while he was here, serving the center quite unselfishly and quite diligently for many years. He came first as a steward with the intention to stay for 6 months. Then he extended that to a year, and then at the end of the year he asked to have a meeting with me, and he said, I think I'd actually like to stay on indefinitely and build a cabin and at my own expense and live in it. And he actually drew up a contract, which is another characteristic of Esko, that he actually drew up a contract that specified that in return for 1 meal a day and the right to stay on the property, he would do 10 hours of work a week for Arrow River. I liked Esko right from the start, and I was cautiously optimistic about this scheme, but I told him at the time, I said, are you sure you want to do this? Because you're going to commit your resources, a great chunk of resources, into building a cabin, and you think you like it here now and you're happy now, but what if in a year or two you get upset and you decide you don't like the place or you don't like me and you want to leave? Well, you've sunk everything into a cabin that you don't own, that belongs to Arrow River. Now this was part of the deal too, that the cabin would be his exclusive use while he was alive, and the property and is Arrow River's, and the cabin reverts to Arrow River when he dies. He said, "Oh, I'm not worried about that." And so it turned out to be good. He stayed here for 13 years, and while he was healthy, for the first 9 or 10 years, while he was still in very good health, he never counted the hours that he was working for Arrow River. I'm sure that most weeks they were much more than 10 hours. He did quite a lot for us in terms of building and construction, sometimes filling in to act as steward, doing a lot of the driving for years until he got unable to drive, doing some of the snow clearing. And he always had this very generous spirit. He wasn't attached to material goods, which is why, even though he had a very successful career for decades, at the end he was pretty well penniless. He was frittered away all his pension on casual purchases, and in many cases for other people, gifts, and he just didn't seem to really be concerned with wealth or possessions. So I think he made a great deal of good karma while he was here. And this is something we should all of us bear in mind in our own lives, that the material goods that we accumulate, wealth we accumulate, is not going to serve us any stead at the end, but the merit that we make, the good deeds that we do, and the kindness and compassion in our hearts, that's what will count at the end. It's a very terrible thing to take a lower rebirth. Suffering in the lower realms is enormous. It's very difficult to Take a fortunate rebirth. Christians have a saying that the path to hell is broad and wide, and the path to heaven is narrow, and this is basically true. That the path of least resistance is just to slide down into the defilements of greed and ill will, sloth and torpor, and just slide down into a lower state of consciousness, and then at the end take a lower rebirth. But with energy, with effort, with a clarity of mind, and with compassion and kindness in the heart, you can make provision for the journey. We, all of us, have, over many lifetimes, we've accumulated a vast store of karma, and there's no way of knowing what kind of a rebirth we're going to take. Within the limits of conditioned existence, we can only improve the odds. This is why it's also very advisable to continue to strive diligently for awakening. And this is a theme that comes up often in the writings and talks of the Burmese masters as an encouragement for diligence, that the only surety against taking a lower rebirth is to attain to the stage of a sotapanna, a stream winner. It's one of the characteristics of a stream winner is that they can not take a lower rebirth, lower than human, after having attained to that state. This is also called the opening of the Dhamma eye, because the essential point about the attainment of stream entry is that the person has had a glimpse of the unconditioned, of nibbana. So with a glimpse of nibbana, the nature of the conditioned is then thrown into new relief, is now understood in a different way. And there's no possibility of sliding downward. There's a certain floor you can't fall below. But consciousness can't sink any further. You can't slide into lower states that lead to a lower rebirth. It's an extremely fundamental change or shift in the core of the being. It's a 180-degree turn in the depth. And it's the beginning of the end of conditionality. It's not possible for a stream winner to be reborn more than 7 times. And then with the attainment of Arahant, the being has a full immersion into the unconditioned. And with that realization, the last threads of attachment to the conditioned fall away, and there's no more impulse after that for taking rebirth. It's not correct to think, as we maybe naively imagine, that this is annihilation. This is something the Buddha specifically denied. When he was accused by teachers of other schools of teaching annihilation, he said, I teach annihilation of suffering. I teach annihilation of the defilements. But nor is it to be thought of as some kind of eternal blissful state. This is the opposite error. It's neither existence nor non-existence, nor neither nor both. It's simply incomprehensible to one who's entirely caught in the conditioned. When I first began to take an interest in Buddhism, like 40 years ago now, I was very attracted to the Theravada literature, like the Visuddhimagga. One of the reasons why it struck me so strongly was the very pure way it dealt with the transcendent. The unconditioned is not personified or made into a state or an object. It's left as this is not that. It's not that which is born. It's not that which dies, etc. So it's not susceptible to being defined within words or logical structures. Whereas many other spiritual schools dress up the transcendent in, pretty clothes for going to church on Sunday and make it mythologize it. So on an intellectual level, this is a strength, I think, of the Theravada school, but it does pose a difficulty for the practitioner, because we're telling you from the outset you've got a lot of work to do. You've got to make a big effort. You've got to do all these practices, and you've got to keep good morality. And if you work really hard, you'll experience this thing that we can't tell you what it is. This is a kind of mysterious unknown. And it's really not very useful to speculate, because your speculation is part of the conditioned experience. So what we need to do is to, having done all the groundwork, in morality and mental discipline, to come to the point of examining closely the simple reality of experience, that which arises before the mind, which is always conditioned objects, and to look closely at the process and see how it is driven by the engine of desire. And don't think of desire only in terms of coarse desires. In this sense desire realm, the desire for sense objects is the noisiest one. It's takes up the most mental space. It demands our attention all the time. And it's in the positive form of desire for pleasant touches, tastes, sounds, smells, etc. But it's also the negative aspect of not wanting unpleasant feelings and touches and tastes and so on. But this is only a very superficial level of desire, because underneath it are the desires for becoming and the desire for not becoming, bhava tanha and vibhava tanha. And these are more fundamental, and even when sense desire is completely quiescent, or even when it's transcended, these remain. And in each moment we're taking an object with consciousness, and it's driven by this force of these three desires, the three tanha, which really boils down to the desire for experience. The mind keeps doing that. It's the best way to think of samsara is as something we do, not as a place or as a macro process, although it is that also. It is a macrocosmic process. But at the level of immediate experience, it's something we do. We're choosing the conditioned. The mind desires an experience, and an object is presented to the mind because of that desire, and because of the nature of the object, it cannot satisfy the mind. This is the characteristic of dukkha in its essence, is the unsatisfying, imperfect, provisional nature of the objects. This imperfection is not something we impose on the objects. This is important to understand. Some superficial popular presentations of the Buddhist teaching would lead one to think that everything is perfect, but it's just the way we look at it is wrong. That's not what the Buddha taught. He taught that the phenomena themselves are inherently imperfect because they're conditioned. They're provisional. They arise due to causes and conditions, so they're intermittent, they're flawed, they're imperfect, they're always a work in progress, never finished. And the mind is seeking, by taking these objects, it's seeking a perfection and a satisfaction it cannot never find in these objects. It's an impossible losing game. There's an old song, one of the lines of which is, playing solitaire all night with a deck of 51. This is basically the reality of conditioned existence. Playing solitaire all night with a deck of 51. Can never ever find that completion within the conditioned objects. And the way to disengage from that process and to find cessation and liberation is to allow that process to continue fully conscious. Ordinarily, the ordinary mind is not fully conscious of the process. It's invested in the process, it's participating in it and identified with it, and has a self, creates a self that is caught in the game. But the mind that's doing vipassana correctly is one that's stepped back a bit from the process and is watching the process unravel. And there's a disengagement that occurs in the mind. The mind's no longer invested in the process. So it just runs down of its own accord. It's like a flywheel in an engine. When you turn the engine off, the flywheel will continue to turn until it just runs out from inertia, if you're not feeding it any fresh energy. And when you're able to disengage to that very deep degree, you're not feeding it anymore, then the mind will eventually just stop doing that. The phrase in the Visuddhimagga is, it alights upon non-occurrence. And that's essentially, that is the realization of the unconditioned. So that Nibbana is not something far away, some mysterious alien existence. It's simply when we stop doing that process of chasing objects, then we reach that deep cessation of the unconditioned. And we're caught in the conditioned, we're caught in this process of birth and death. And this is the inevitable fate of all things that are born, is that they die. And as long as we're invested in the condition, this death is not the end of our misery. It's just we're just beginning a new episode. And it must be that way for the mind that is not fully awakened, because the process goes on. The mind is seeking an object. So at the moment of death, there's still karma and desire outstanding. But the continuity of consciousness arising within a particular physical form is now ended. The next consciousness which arises cannot be associated with a physical form anymore because it has ceased functioning. but it still has this impulse to seek an object. So it arises in the next moment elsewhere, as conditioned by its previous karma. And it takes a new rebirth, either a better one or a worse one. The Buddha always presented this process as something that, if it's well understood, it's seen as terrible and frightening, something one ought to want to escape from. He spoke about the number of skulls you've left behind from having your head chopped off, either as a criminal or as an animal. If all these skulls were piled up, they'd be higher than the Himalaya mountains. He spoke about the tears you shed from the loss of loved ones would fill up the great ocean. He had a whole long series of these similes, and at the end, this is a section in the Samyutta Nikaya, and at the end of each verse is a refrain. It says, contemplating this, one should say enough and cease filling the cemeteries. So for those of you who knew our friend Esco, when someone is recently deceased, we don't know how long the rebirth process takes. The correct practice, if you wish to help them, is to offer merit. This is the practice in Buddhism for the deceased, is that you make a dedication when you do a good deed or an act of kindness or generosity, to silently dedicate the merit of this act to the deceased. The chant that we do, or that the monks do at mealtime, Yata Varivaha Pura, that's some verses from the Outside the Wall Sutta, which is the sutta that defines this practice of making merit. And the backstory to it is that King Bimbisara offered a meal to the Buddha and the monks, and then evening after, at night, or the night after, he heard all this wailing and moaning and shuffling and banging and all these noises, these eerie noises in the night. And he asked the Buddha about it, and the Buddha said, these are your relatives in the ghost realm. Then he told a long story about these particular ghosts, that they were last in the human birth in the time of Kassapa Buddha, many, many hundreds of years ago. And they came as ghosts to Kassapa and asked him when they would escape from the ghost realm. And he said, in the future there will arise another Buddha, and there will be a king at that time who is one of your relatives from this life, and he will offer merit and help you out of the ghost realm. And King Bimbisara had neglected to make merit, and he didn't know about this business, and so they were all upset. They'd waited hundreds and hundreds of years. Now this guy does that. Look, he blew his chance. So then the Buddha told Bimbisara about it, so he did another meal. And during the course of the meal, every little thing that he did as an offering became multiplied in the ghost realm. He sprinkled some water over the Buddha's hands before the meal, and that became fountains of water in the ghost realm that they could bathe in. And he put a few grains of rice in his bowl, and that became laden banquet tables in the ghost realm, and so on. The theory, the idea behind it, as then explained in the commentaries in the Abhidhamma, is that you can only really make karma for yourself, but what happens with merit offered to one in the ghost realm is that by that act of dedication, they hear that and they rejoice in the good deed you're doing. and it's really the only positive karma they're capable of making is rejoicing in others' good deeds. And then this gives them an opportunity. I think of the ghost realm as kind of an incomplete, it's an incomplete death. Most of the stories about ghosts are beings that are still, after their death, they're still attached to the places and people of their previous incarnation, and they're like hanging around, they can't let go. But nor can they experience it or enjoy it because they don't have a corporeal body. So they're in a state of great suffering, and it's like a great hunger and a thirst. And they need that release of letting go in order to take a rebirth in another form. What I could see from the case of Esko, he didn't have a great deal of attachment to place or to objects or forms. So I think he will very likely, very quickly seek a new rebirth. So to sum up, let's take from this experience a contemplation of the reality of birth and death, and remember in the next while, if you want to do something for Esko, to make merit